Okay, right. It's very important to say at the start that the views to be expressed now by John Rawls and Robert Nozick are not necessarily the views of John Spicer and David Misselbrook, respectively. However, it will be a useful exercise, I think, for all of us in order to bring our discussions to a head this afternoon, and perhaps a bit of fun too. So, I will, without further ado, I will introduce John Rawls, author of A Theory of Justice and many other fine works in political theory. You're going first, John. Late lamented, John Rawls passed away while I was doing my undergraduate degree, and we are indebted to you for your presence here, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. You'll notice I'm sitting in the original position.
You are. An in-joke for political philosophers.
Yes, my name is John Rawls. You may call me Jack, everybody else does. I'm 95, and I died 13 years ago. That has had an influence on my cognitions, my functioning, so please excuse me if it slips a little during the course of our discussions. I'm a scholar of justice. I was. I didn't go far beyond Harvard, really. I did in my youth. I saw some terrible things. I saw two brothers die, one of diphtheria, another of pneumonia. They caught it from me. I saw terrible things in the Pacific theatre of World War II. I think they probably informed my thinking. I was a scholar in Oxford, so I have a relationship with your country, and I want to make some comments about that at the end. I want to offer you a notion of justice as fairness, and that's better than any libertarian or utilitarian cooked-up theory you might hear in the next few minutes. Consider this thought experiment, if you will. Imagine yourself as an intelligent person of sentience, of your faculties, but before your birth, floating above the world with no idea where you may end up being born, raised, and live. It could be as the child of a rich family in Hampstead, I gather that's a fine district of your country, or a poor single parent in Mile End. You have no idea where you might be. In such a place, you would want to set up a system of justice, of fairness, where your chances would be the best you could possibly get, where the schools and hospitals and housing and access to the law were arranged along those lines. You'd want a fair system, at least towards the advantage of those disadvantaged persons where you may end up, and minimize the chances of you ending up, it follows, as one of the disadvantaged. I call this the veil of ignorance. So if you follow that logic a little bit further, I ended up in my thinking with several principles of justice, and I just want to briefly tell you about them now. One, that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty with a similar liberty for others. They call that, the people after me called it, the liberty principle. Secondly, social inequalities should be arranged so that offices and positions should be open to all under a fair equality of opportunity. And my successors have called that the opportunity principle. But most interestingly, I think, those social inequalities should be arranged so that they are of the greatest benefit to the least advantaged as well. Because that's what happens if you were thinking about it from your position behind the veil of ignorance. Now, those social goods that might be in tune with those things I've said could be things like schools, hospitals, and other aspects of life. And what I want to end up saying is that I think that these principles offer you something in your country to do with the organisation of your healthcare. And I would argue that it follows that collaborative principles should be applied when you're thinking about how you organise your healthcare. And I hear on the grapevine that you do it rather well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, or should I say Jack. It's delightful to talk to you posthumously. I understand that you also were something of a theologian in your younger years. Do you recall?
I do.
You do recall.
I recall wanting to be a priest at one stage,
Indeed,
in fact,
yeah,
but it was the Pacific Theatre of War that blasted it out of me.
Yeah, well, your works in theology have now come to light in the last few years in Princeton, and we enjoy reading those too. Thank you very much, Jack Rawls. So over to Professor Robert Nozick, indeed, who died, strangely enough, in the same year as John. One of those tricks of strange elements of history. No doubt you've got you entirely agree with John Rawls. Over to you.
It's great to see you, Jack, after 13 years to be dug up for an occasion like this. Now, I mean, one thing you'll notice is John here. He died at the age of 81, whereas I died at the age of 63. And isn't life just a bitch? Now, John, you see, is painting a very lovely picture for us. He starts with a thought experiment. You'll notice that he starts with a thought experiment. And there's something about this epistemological technique itself which I want to point out. And in my excellent book, which I hope you're going to go away and read. By the way, it's a darn sight easier to read than his book. In my excellent book, I point out it's rather like taking one of these children's balloons and you sort of squeeze it here and you squeeze it there and you squeeze it there until it's sort of in the right shape that you want it, but it's only going to stay in that shape moment, so you better take a photo of it very quick before this mirage disappears. You see, John has this wonderful thought experiment, but it's a thought experiment. Can you give me, firstly, the historical precedent for any society that has ordered its affairs like this? Can you give me any reason why the particular values that you have retro-engineered out of this thought experiment should be the values that we should advocate? You see, John, you're a great guy, and I love you dearly as a Harvard colleague, and we've spent many a good time talking together in the days when we were alive. The problem is that this does not grapple with the real world. The real world is unfair, and you're a contractarian, so you want to make a castle in the air, whereas I actually am a moral realist, and I start with a number of key points. One is the Kantian point that humans are ends in themselves. Humans are not means to something. Each individual human is an end in himself, and therefore there are issues of rights and issues of justice. So if we look at an original position, well, John Locke talked about original positions in his state of nature theory. And the state of nature, before people impose any order upon it, is, as Hobbes taught us, nasty, poor, brutal, and short. So the issue is, what justification have I for taking your goods if you happen to be more fortunate than me? And I would say there is only a minimal justification. Yes, we certainly have a common interest, and the state therefore has a natural right to exist to defend our rights against force, against theft, against fraud, and to enforce freely entered into contracts. But if we go beyond that, I have to ask, John, by what right do you demand that I should work until about the middle of May every year, that every penny I earn until the middle of May goes to the state in order to benefit those who happen to be poorer than me? Now, by what moral right is that? That actually is enforced labour. So, John, you are saying I should be enslaved from January until the middle of May. I'm not committed to any specific social order. We may have charities, we may have voluntary works, we have many other things. What I am committed to is saying that the state has no right to forcibly take my money and my labour and redistribute it by some arbitrary means. Because, John, your thought experiment is arbitrary. Your thought experiment is lovely because you're a nice guy. But your thought experiment is arbitrary. It has no moral foundation. And therefore, with regret, it's one that I must reject.
Well, thank you very much for his open statements, John and Robert. I mean, John was very nice about the NHS here, the collaborative nature of the NHS, historically at least. I suspect you take a different view, Robert. Is that right? Would you say
No,
that the NHS
no.
is built on slave labour, according to your argument, taxed, funded by slave labour, and essentially distorts the principle of moral responsibility, self-responsibility. Also deprives people of their duly entitled inheritance, of course, by inheritance tax, which you're also against, at least in some form. So, I mean, the whole of the NHS is built on slavery and theft.
The whole of the NHS is certainly built on theft, regrettably. But I think to answer it, though, I'd like to offer you another couple of thought experiments of my own. Because you see, who can argue against the NHS, motherhood, apple pie, blah-de-blah? You know, these things produce many social goods. But if you produce a social good by wrong means, then can you justify that? Let me offer you a couple of thought experiments. Hey, you're saying the state's such a wonderful thing. Why don't we go a little bit further? We've got the SAS these days just hanging around there doing nothing. Let's send the SAS out to shoot criminals. That'll be brilliant. That's a further extension of the state for a common good, apart from the criminals, obviously. That would be one example. Or here we are sitting here. We talked earlier about kidneys. Well, why doesn't everyone just have their tissue type on the state database? And when it is discovered that you, Josh, happen to be the right match for someone who needs a kidney, the state taps you on the shoulder and says, Josh, I'm going to take your kidney. Now, I think you would agree with me that in both those examples, one could make a utilitarian argument as for it being for the common good, but you are using means that are totally unjustified and indeed wrong.
John,
Now, so I just want to come back to my point that it is wrong to take away the fruits of a man's labour other than by a freely entered into contract. So the job of the state should be to uphold freely entered into contracts.
And birth, of course, is no sign of a contract, right?
Well, this is why I pointed out that John lived till 81 and I died at 63. That's unfair. What am I going to do? Retrospectively come and shoot him at the age of 63? This is moral luck. Now, I think, John, I'm right in saying that you actually...
I'm going to bring John in at this point, actually. Thank you very much, Robert. You want to respond to some of his
Well,
points?
thank you, Professor Nozick. And I take the point about the book on the chip. And having written it, I freely acknowledge that yours is a much easier read. Having done that.
Which edition are you thinking of?
The first.
The first,
the
yeah.
first. Thought experiments. I think we must engender thought experiments with the currency they deserve. And mine is a particular kind of thought experiment, which you can critique or not as you think fit. But it was good enough for Hobbes to imagine the state of nature. It was good enough for any utilitarian to imagine a trolley argument. So I think I have a certain justification for that. Let me go back to my difference principle, or rather what flows from the veil of ignorance. I would argue that the people sitting behind the veil of ignorance are acting as rationally self-interested persons. This is not arbitrary. Rational self-interest permeates all of us. And a rationally self-interested person would be interested, among other things, in knowing that he or she would end up in the most advantaged situation that he or she possibly could. If you take that out, then they could end up anywhere. They could end up in the Mile End Road instead of in Hampstead, and what flows from that. So I think there is an argument which is almost Kantian, which goes along with mine in that regard. You also make the point about utilitarian arguments against. A utilitarian could say, well, I'm behind the veil of ignorance, I'll take my chances. I could end up in an A grade place or in a Z grade place. The trouble is, would you really want to take that chance? Would a utilitarian even live with the consequences of having pulled a bad card? And I don't think he or she would.
Okay, now let's go back to looking at this thought experiment then. Part of the problem is that it is an entirely hypothetical thought experiment. Now, if the thought experiment...
That's what a thought experiment is.
Actually,
Important definitional move there. Thank you, John.
I'll tell you one. You just disillusioned me. I always thought Philippa Foot actually was at the side of that railway trolley pulling the lever. So that was a thought experiment. No. Okay. Anyway, no, but it's hypothetical in the sense that I believe that you have retro-engineered it for the liberal ends that you desire. So as I say, you're a great guy, and that's good. So you start with the notion I desire liberal ends, and therefore you retro-engineer this particular form of thought experiment. As I say, I've offered you a couple of other thought experiments which you don't seem to critique that much. So if that was a thought experiment that had real purchase in the real world, as I would argue Hobbes's does and as Locke's has, then if that were the case, one would expect to see certain real gravitations towards not just the outcome, which, as I say, I believe you've retro-engineered, but towards some justification of the thought experiment itself in a more solid form of theory. Whereas I can offer you a very solid form of theory, which is a moral realist theory, and that is to do with Kantian respect for persons and human rights. Now, it seems to me that you're perfectly happy to tread right over human rights because you desire a certain liberal outcome. And whilst I have a certain type of mild admiration for that liberal outcome, I honestly don't think it justifies the negation of those rights, because I don't think you will have a just society if you ignore and trample over people's rights in order to lead to it, which is why I gave you those other thoughts.
What I want to do now, or shortly, is to ask the audience here to engage a bit with Robert and John, but I think we need to get a bit more concrete about what your comments here mean for markets and healthcare. I mean, if we weren't where we were, as it were, now in the UK, what would you have liked to have seen instead? Are there particular failings or faults in the British healthcare system which are more or less indebted to the Rawlsian vision or its predecessors? And are there sort of particular malign effects which you'd like to see overcome by perhaps the adoption of your approach?
I'm glad you asked about malign effects. Now, you'll note the title of my book, Anarchy, State and Utopia, because what is utopia? Well, the utopia is the notion of far greater individual freedom to build the type of societies that we wish. And frankly, this will be different for different people. And I suspect in a Nozickian society, I'll be in a different corner of it than John, although we'll still meet at Harvard and have our lovely conversations. Or we would if we were still alive. So my point really is that we can see, I mean, John himself wrote about moral hazard if you simply keep on handing out welfare and support people. And I do believe that
it will lead to gross irresponsibility. Is that your point?
It has the potential to do so. I'm not saying it does that universally. But what I would say is that humans should be left to form their own types of preferred societies.
For example, what? How would healthcare be arranged if it wasn't universally accessible from a point of view? What's better than that? I mean, surely that's a very safe and pleasant way to live, to have that sense of...
It might be safe and pleasant, but you're trampling over people's rights to get there. It's rather reminiscent. I've had some dreams about living in certain Middle Eastern countries recently, and it's very pleasant for white people living in certain Middle Eastern countries if you just trample over the rights of migrant workers and pay them low wages. So if you grab from one lot to give to another lot, yes, it's certainly very pleasant for the winners. I would agree with that. But no, to come back to Anarchy, State and Utopia, I think the notion of utopia is that different social groupings should be allowed to form their own ways of living. And there will be some social groupings who I've no doubt will form very socialised ways of living, and there may be such as John. I've got to be honest with you, Josh, I don't really specifically advocate one specific way. I do think that people should have far greater freedom to decide how to spend their own resources and whether they wish to join private insurance-based systems or a more socialised system or whatever. I think that they have a right to make that choice.
And how about for you? I mean, you look at British healthcare compared to your home country, United States of America. Isn't it just so much better in the US? There's a great bit of freedom of choice. You've got the flourishing of individual enterprise, all sorts of health insurance schemes, of hospitals run by private enterprise very efficiently with lovely ethos and so on. And here you just have the dead hand of the state, inspired by your kind of Rawlsian vision. Isn't this just dreadful? All those PPists trained at Oxford read your books and come up and delivered to us an awful, bland healthcare system. Isn't this your inheritance you've left all of us?
Well, I would say that the marketised healthcare system that pertains to the US, where I lived for many, many years, considerably more years than my colleague here, as he's pointed out, has actually ended up in a system with the worst health outcomes possibly in the world. It has the best health outcomes for a very small minority, and it has the worst health outcomes for very much more. So I think I have to say I agree with President Obama that the healthcare system of the US is in dire need of therapy, and he's begun to engineer it. To go back to the connection that you asked me to establish between my theoretical position and the British NHS, let's push the analogy about the veil of ignorance, offering the greatest advantage either to everyone or to the least disadvantaged. And I would argue that that collaborative notion is actually pretty close to the risk pool that underlays the British NHS. We don't know whether we're going to die at 63 or at 90, or whatever it might be. But we do know that at no immediate cost to ourselves, or you know rather in your country, that whatever happens, you will actually be entitled to a level of healthcare which may not be the best that's available in America, but is good enough for the whole.
Well, we're very grateful to you both for starting our conversation. We're fortunate to have a wide range of expertise in the audience, including, I believe, Karl Marx is present with us this afternoon. I don't know if you want to address any of the points made briefly.
I would, actually. Well, first of all, this debate reminds me of the great 18th century German poet, Heinrich Heine, who wrote a poem which is called Disputation, about a duel, a verbal duel between a rabbi and a monk, or a priest, in the aula of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel in Toledo, arguing about whose God is the real one. And after 4 hours of debate, the Queen is totally baffled and confused. She doesn't know, she can't decide, and it's so hot. So she asked her maid, tell me who is right. And the maid says, well, I could have given it in German, it would rhyme. The maid says, who is right? I don't know, but I think it is obvious that both stink very much. Where's the problem? Where's the problem? The problem is that instead of what appears here to be as a debate between two extremes, is actually a debate between very good friends, just in two different periods. Here, Rawls is the great ideologue of the capitalist welfare state. He says, and if you analyze, if you do what I said before, if you analyze the presuppositions of what he said, of his society. Now let's see how we juggle it in a way, how we play it in a way that would not make the poor too miserable and angry, and the rich not too poor and miserable and angry. Let's decrease the gaps in minimally, only to such a degree that will keep the majority happy and sustainable.
Thank you, Carl. And on Robert?
And Nozick is exactly the ideologue of the current system. Laissez-faire.
Thank you very much, Carl. So, who else would like to contribute to the conversation? Comments, questions for either of these thinkers, or indeed for Karl Marx? Thank you very much, Dr. Hain.
Professor Nozick, I was just interested, do you feel that human beings have anything in common with one another?
As a biological species, what's the context of your question? Yes. No.
As
I'll.
an existential being.
Yeah, I'm not a great existentialist, but I think.
That was my question.
No, I think, of course, we do. We have a common interest in having our rights upheld. We have a common interest in. May I finish my brief answer?
Because I then want to ask you another question. If we have something in common, how are you going to find out what it is?
Okay. I think the main things we have in common are that humans are ends, not means, and that humans have rights.
So you presuppose the answer to the question that what I'm suggesting to you is, how are you going to find out what people have in common, rather than you saying you already know?
Oh, okay.
What is it? By what means are you going to find out what it is that human beings have in common with one another?
Yes. Well, I think all epistemology has a lot of methodological problems. And in fact, what you tend to do when you start down a particular epistemological track is exactly this problem of retroengineering that I'm talking about. And this is why I started by discussing these squeezy balloons. Because, you see, I think what's different about my philosophy is that the problems with it are visible and on the outside. I think a lot of other philosophers take as their philosophical method, they know where they want to end up, and they make this lovely appearance that is very smooth and photogenic, but actually...
But I think if you're going to avoid that retrofitting, that retroengineering,
yeah.
you have to start by identifying what it is that human beings have in common.
Yes, okay.
And one way to do that, for example, might be to say, what is it that we all have in common? And what you might come up with is something very similar to the veil of ignorance.
No, I think what I'd like to come up with is two
That's what you'd like to come up with, and that's retroengineering.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hain, for making this point. Professor Nozick, we need to have other voices come in for a moment. Yes,
Okay.
please, thank you.
I'm interested, sorry.
No, you're first. Yes, please.
Interested in Robert and whether your philosophy changed as you underwent your own personal experience of suffering as you lost your health and ultimately died.
No, as time went by, I mean, my last book was published just round about the time of my death, actually, so I was writing, because I had quite a prolonged battle with my stomach cancer, regrettably. If any of you have come up with a cure in the meantime, I'd be interested to speak to you afterwards. But to be honest, the short answer was no. And in fact, interestingly, in my later life, I was quite interested in questions of epistemology, which is why I was a little disappointed not to be able to answer that question. But the short answer is no.
Thank you. We are indeed fortunate to have Martin Luther with us as well, who is a representative of the Lutheran tradition, who spoke so eloquently about love earlier. What would you like to say at this point?
Actually, I wasn't thinking about Martin Luther,
Okay.
but the capabilities approach. But what would John Rawls now say about the distribution of basic or primary goods? So is it enough to operate with this difference principle? So do you think that Amartya Sen and so this effective freedom is really undermining your arguments, or would you come up with something to answer this criticism of Sen last book?
I think they were after my time. So I can't speak with authority, all things being equal. But I don't think necessarily what you're implying is a challenge to the difference principle. Perhaps you'd like to describe it more fully.
Yes, so that this inequality is allowed only to extent that it helps the worst off. So that this disbalance should be balanced by the principle of that it helps first off. But people who so if you don't take into account at the same time the real differences and needs of people by distribution and the distribution of goods, would you say that it activates this dynamics of justice really? Is it really enough to operate only with this? Okay, we have these differences and we redistribute goods to extent it's needed, but it's really enough.
Well, I think that this is a question about distributive justice as much as anything, isn't it? And I know that's a hot topic for you in your country at the moment, in the distribution of scarce medical resources, which you could argue is one of my primary goods, and I think I made reference to it. If I get your point correctly, and tell me if I haven't, is that sufficient? So are there additional distributive mechanisms you may wish to apply beyond the difference principle, highlighting, if you like, the necessity to work to the advantage of the least disadvantaged? I suppose the other position would be to work to the advantage of everybody. And I'm specifically saying that there is a difference between those two things, and that the difference principle says that one should, it's actually the benefit of all, to work to the benefit of the least disadvantaged. And I think that is what flows from the veil of ignorance.
I'm going to bring in two more voices and then finish. So Roger, please, and then Maureen. Thank you.
I don't know if this question can be addressed here, actually. It's about, but it's been touched on throughout today about professionalism. I guess I just want to ask why, probably to John, why shouldn't doctoring become schmoctoring if the conditions in the marketplace are relevant?
Okay, thank you. Why shouldn't doctoring become
schmoctoring, as in Nozick's book, in one of his footnotes, where he's talking about practice positivism?
Okay, so that's a question, I guess, for Robert, if he knows how to respond to that, and then Maureen. Thank you.
So I guess just a quick question for Professor Nozick, but maybe Professor Rawls has an opinion. If I understood correctly near the start, you sort of accused Professor Rawls of taking an ahistoric view with his theory, since from behind the veil he couldn't take account of historical contingencies. Is this not a bit rich, given the, some might argue, willfully ahistoric theory you present in your book? So as an example, you only became a successful Harvard scholar enjoying all the privileges you did, not by dint of your own hard work, although I'm sure there was some, but by the fact of your parents were able to give you an education, you came from a certain social class, you were a white male, things that are not afforded to other people in society.
Yes, I think there's some truth in that. I'd have a couple of things to say about that. My colleague John stated, a person does not morally deserve their talents. Well, that's interesting because, I mean, obviously it's what Bernard Williams calls moral luck. Now, what are we going to do? Are we going to say the state owns your moral talents then? Are we going to say the state owns all of our personal attributes and can distribute them in an arbitrary fashion as it wishes? Because when all is said and done, John's difference principle is an arbitrary principle because it doesn't have any force of morality behind it. I think it's really bad luck that I died at the age of 63. But I'm not going to complain to the state about it. we live in a world where there is a lot of difference. To me, two things matter a lot. Firstly, that the initial position needs to be as fair as possible. And so if somebody has wronged me, then it is right that that wrong should be rectified in some sense. But secondly, whatever that initial position is, it is for me to enter into open contracts willingly in order to improve my position. And I didn't get a place as a professor at Harvard just because of accident of birth.
Well, John has got one point to make, I think, in response, and then...
I just wanted to remind you, Professor Nozick, of the basketball player in your
Indeed, Wilt Chamberlain,
Wilt
yes,
Chamberlain,
is a good example.
was a very lucky guy.
He was.
He was the best basketball player in the world at the time, and you argue very powerfully, but wrongly, I think.
I was going to say thank you for offering me a slam dunk, actually.
The perspective that he should be automatically entitled to the fruits of his natural abilities.
Well, we're going to have to pause there and stop there, I think. Let's time runs away with us. If you do have further questions for John and Robert, please do catch them before the Undertaker's return to reinter them. We are grateful for your brief rise, and we'll see what happens in the future, I suppose. It's interesting that we've returned to talk about the deployment of talents, which is where I finished my talk earlier on today. The question of what is it that follows from the having of talents? A person does not morally deserve their talents. This was the statement of your how are the talents to be used, was the question I was posing earlier. Anyway, we're grateful to you both. I hope that was enjoyable. They shall now come out of their roles. And we're grateful to John Spicer and to David Misselbrook for this conversation. And I would underline that the views expressed are not necessarily those of John Spicer or David Misselbrook.
Could I say that we actually did this because we were asked to debate two ways the markets of healthcare, and neither of us was prepared to take a particular position. Which one I'll leave for you to guess. So we decided to do it in persona.
But may we thank, let's say John and David for this. Thank you.